He banished his pregnant daughter to save his name, but what he didn't realize was that her revenge would one day destroy his entire legacy. This isn't a story about forgiveness. It's a story about a debt of pain so immense it could only be repaid by burning an empire to the ground, an empire built on the hollow foundations of pride and lies. It begins, as so many tragedies do, on a night when the sky itself seemed to be weeping, a relentless, punishing rain lashing against the weathered bones of Blackwood Farm. The wind howled through the eaves of the old house, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and a deeper, more bitter scent of betrayal. This was a place steeped in tradition, a land that had been in the Blackwood family for generations, every acre a testament to the iron will of the men who had worked it. But tonight, that will was not being used to nurture life, but to extinguish it. Inside, the air was thick with a silence more deafening than the storm outside. It was a silence born of fear, a suffocating blanket woven by the patriarch of the family, Silas Blackwood. Silas was a man in his late 50s, but he seemed as old and unyielding as the ancient oaks that bordered his property. His face was a roadmap of hard years and harder judgments, his skin tanned and creased like old leather, and his eyes, the color of a winter sky, held no warmth, only a chilling, absolute authority. He stood in the center of the living room, a titan of rural dignity, his presence sucking all the oxygen from the air, and before him, trembling like a leaf in the gale, stood his daughter, Ilara. She was only 17, a whisper of a girl with hair the color of harvested wheat and eyes that once held the vast, hopeful expanse of a summer sky. Now they were just wide pools of terror. Her thin cotton dress, soaked through by the rain, clung to her small frame, revealing the undeniable, gentle swell of her belly. The conflict had been brewing for weeks, a storm within the storm ever since her mother, Martha, had discovered the truth. But tonight it had broken with a violence that shook the very foundations of their world. Silas had dragged her from her room, his grip on her arm like a band of steel, his knuckles white. He hadn't shouted. Shouting was for men who had lost control. Silas Blackwood was always in control. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, guttural rumble, a sound that seemed to come from the very earth he so fiercely protected. He spoke of honor, of legacy, of the Blackwood name, a name he treated not as a simple identifier, but as a sacred text, a holy relic that she, with her quiet, desperate sin, had defiled. He saw her not as his child, not as a frightened girl who had made a mistake born from a deep and aching loneliness, but as a stain, a blemish on the perfect portrait of his life's work. Her mother, Martha, and her older brother, Thomas, stood by the doorway, their forms little more than shadows, against the flickering lamplight. They were statues carved from fear. Martha's face was a mask of silent agony, her hands clenched so tightly her nails bit into her palms, but no sound escaped her lips. She had learned long ago that to challenge Silas was to invite the storm into her own heart. Thomas, the golden son, the heir to the Blackwood legacy, simply stared at the floor, his jaw tight. He was the future of this farm, the vessel for all of Silas's ambitions, and in this moment, his silence was a form of consent, an implicit agreement that his sister was a necessary sacrifice to preserve the family's standing. Ilara's eyes pleaded with them, a desperate, silent scream for someone, anyone, to speak for her, to stand between her and the cold fury of her father. But they remained frozen, prisoners in their own home, their love for her outweighed by their terror of him. With the entire family as his jury, and him as the sole judge and executioner, Silas dragged Ilara onto the wide, rain-slicked porch. The cold wind whipped at her, a brutal shock against her wet skin. She stumbled, her bare feet finding no purchase on the slippery wood. He held her upright, his fingers digging deeper into her arm. "You have brought shame to this house," he declared, his voice cutting through the roar of the thunder. It was a proclamation, a verdict delivered for the wind and the rain and the darkness to witness. Ilara finally found her voice, a broken, choked sob. "Father, please," she begged, the words torn from her throat. "Please don't do this." For her plea, for her moment of desperate humanity, she was rewarded with a sharp, stinging slap across the face. The sound was like a gunshot in the night, a crack that echoed louder and longer than any thunderclap, a sound that would be seared into her memory forever. He let her fall to her knees on the wet porch boards, Her cheek burned, a fire of humiliation and pain spreading through her. Then he tossed a small, worn canvas bag at her feet. It landed with a soft, pathetic thud. Inside, she knew, were a few folded clothes and perhaps a single piece of bread, a cruel parody of provision. It was not an act of mercy, but a final act of dismissal, the kind of gesture one would make when casting a stray dog back out into the storm. "You are no longer a Blackwood," he said, his voice now utterly devoid of all emotion, as cold and dead as the winter ground. "You have no family here. You have no home here. From this moment on, you are nothing to me." He turned without another word, his broad back a wall she could never hope to scale, and walked back into the house. The heavy oak door, the very door she had run through as a laughing child, the door that had always meant safety and belonging, began to close. It was a massive thing, built from the heartwood of a tree that had stood on this land for 100 years, a symbol of Blackwood's strength and permanence. For Ilara, watching it swing shut, it was the gate of a tomb. The latch clicked into place with a sound of chilling finality, a sound that severed the last thread of hope, a sound that locked her out of her own life, her own past, her own identity. That sound, the solid thud of oak meeting its frame, would become the rhythm of her nightmares for years to come. It was the sound of a father's love dying. It was the sound of her world ending. And you, who are watching this story unfold, have you ever felt a moment like that? Have you ever had a door slammed shut on your world, not by a stranger but by the very hands that were supposed to guide you, to protect you? Have you ever been judged so completely, so finally, by the people who were meant to love you unconditionally, judged by them without them ever truly knowing the story that was living inside your heart? It is a wound that goes deeper than bone, a kind of soul-deep betrayal that changes a person forever. For Ilara, kneeling on that porch in the heart of the storm, that wound was just beginning to open, and she had no idea then that the scar it would leave would become her greatest weapon. The cold was the first thing to truly break through the shock, a deep, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with the rain and everything to do with the absolute crushing loneliness that now enveloped her. She was 17, pregnant, and utterly alone, cast out into a world that had no place for a girl like her. A memory flashed behind her eyes, a fleeting image of a sunlit afternoon in the hayloft, of a young farmhand with kind eyes and a gentle touch. He had been the first person to ever see her, the real Ilara, the one who dreamed of a life beyond the suffocating expectations of being a Blackwood daughter. He'd spoken to her of cities, of oceans, of a world where she could be more than just a future wife for a neighboring landowner. Her pregnancy wasn't an act of defiance. It was a naive, desperate grasp at a different kind of life, a life where she might be loved for who she was, not for the name she carried. It was a secret she had held close, a fragile seed of hope, a hope her father had just ripped out of the ground and crushed under his boot. The rain fell harder, washing the tears from her face, mixing with the blood from her lip where the force of the slap had split the skin. She looked up at the house, at the warm, yellow squares of light in the windows. Inside was her family, her bed, her entire history, but it was as distant to her now as a foreign country. She was an exile, a ghost already haunting the edges of their lives. She knew with a certainty that chilled her more than the rain, that her father would forbid her name to be spoken ever again. She would be erased. But as she pushed herself to her feet, her body aching and her spirit shattered, something shifted within her. The terror was still there, a frantic bird beating its wings against her ribs, but beneath it, a tiny, hard ember of something else began to glow. It was a cold, quiet rage. Silas Blackwood believed he was pruning a diseased branch to save the tree. He thought he was exercising his right as a patriarch, cleansing his house of dishonor to protect his precious legacy. What he couldn't see, what his pride made him blind to, was that he wasn't cutting away a weakness. He was forging a weapon. He was creating an enemy with nothing left to lose, an enemy who knew all his secrets, all his vanities, all his fears. He had cast his daughter into the storm, expecting the world to devour her, to swallow her up and erase his mistake. He had no way of knowing that she would not be devoured by the storm. In time, she would learn to command it. She had lost everything in a single night, her family, her home, her name, her future. But what Silas Blackwood didn't know, what no one in that warm, silent house could have possibly predicted, was that in the cold, unforgiving mud of that driveway, something else was being born. It was not the child in her womb, but a resolve, a promise she made to the howling wind and the weeping sky, a fire fueled by the purest injustice, a fire that would be banked and tended in the long, cruel years to come, a fire that would one day grow hot enough to consume everything he held dear, to turn his legacy of pride into nothing more than a pile of ash. And you will witness every step of her journey, from the broken girl in the rain to the architect of a revenge so perfect, so complete, it would become a legend. With one last look at the dark, imposing silhouette of the house, Elara Blackwood, or the girl who once was, turned her back on it forever. She clutched the pathetic little bag to her chest, the rain plastering her hair to her face, and took her first faltering step down the long, muddy lane that led away from the farm. Each step was an agony, a tearing away from the only world she had ever known. But with each step, the trembling in her limbs began to subside, replaced by a grim, unfamiliar strength. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know how she would survive. But she knew one thing with an unshakable clarity that burned brighter than any lamp in her father's house. She would survive. And one day, she would return. The storm that was meant to destroy her would only serve as her baptism, washing away the obedient daughter and leaving in her place something far more dangerous, something her father would never see coming until it was far, far too late. To understand the cruelty of that storm-tossed night, you must first understand the suffocating quiet that came before it. You have to walk the grounds of Blackwood Farm not as they were on that night of ruin, but as they were in the long, sun-scorched years leading up to it. Blackwood Farm was less a place of life and more a monument to one man's pride. It was a sprawling acreage of fields that had once been rich and dark, yielding harvests that were the envy of the county. But that was in Silas's father's time. Now the land itself seemed to be holding its breath, tired and depleted. A subtle drought had taken hold, not just in the sky, but in the very soil. The earth was cracked and pale in places. The corn grew a little shorter each year, and the great oak at the end of the lane had a sickness in its branches, a slow, creeping decay that everyone saw, but no one dared to mention. This land was a reflection of the family that worked it, impressive from a distance, but crumbling from within. Silas Blackwood ruled this kingdom of dust and duty with an authority that was absolute. His love for the farm was not the gentle love of a nurturer. It was the possessive, jealous love of a king for his territory. Every morning, he would stand on that same porch where he would one day condemn his daughter, a mug of black coffee steaming in his hand, and he would survey his domain. His gaze didn't linger on the beauty of the sunrise or the dew on the grass. It was an inspection. He was looking for flaws, for weaknesses, for any sign that his control was slipping. He saw the fence post leaning by the south pasture, the rust creeping up the side of the old tractor, the dry patch in the alfalfa field. Each imperfection was a personal insult, a mark against his name. The Blackwood name was everything, a fragile shield he held up against a world he believed was constantly trying to tear him down. Within this kingdom, Elara was a carefully managed asset. She was not raised to work the land. That was a man's world, Thomas's world. She was raised to adorn the house. Her life was a meticulously crafted routine of domesticity. She learned to cook, to sew, to manage the household accounts with a quiet efficiency that was expected and therefore invisible. She was taught to arrange flowers in a vase just so, to keep the floors polished to a mirror shine, and to smile politely when neighbors visited, but never to offer an opinion of her own. Her thoughts, her dreams, her very soul were considered irrelevant to the grand project of the Blackwood legacy. She was a beautiful, silent daughter, a testament to Silas's ability to produce perfection, and her only prescribed future was to be married off to a neighboring landowner, a transaction that would consolidate power and property, another brick in the wall of her father's pride. The emotional neglect was as constant and oppressive as the summer humidity. Silas's approval was a rare and precious commodity, doled out for obedience and retracted for the smallest infraction. Elara remembered a time when she was 12, proudly showing him a drawing she had made of the farm. He had glanced at it for a moment, his face unreadable, before pointing out that the barn roof was drawn at the wrong angle. He wasn't being cruel, not in his mind. He was teaching her precision. He was teaching her the Blackwood way. But what she learned was that her effort was meaningless, that only flawless execution mattered, and that she would never be able to achieve it. Love in her house was not a gift. It was a wage, and her wages were always low. Have you ever felt that? Have you ever lived in a house full of people, your own family, and felt utterly, completely alone, like a ghost haunting the hallways of your own life? It is a silence that eats away at you, a hunger for connection that can make you do desperate things. Her brother Thomas was the sun around which the Blackwood world turned. He was 2 years older, built in his father's image, broad-shouldered and quiet. From the time he could walk, Silas had taken him out into the fields, teaching him the rhythms of the land, the language of the seasons, the weight of the legacy he would one day inherit. Thomas received the gruff words of praise, the rare clap on the shoulder, the shared moments of silent understanding between men working the soil. He was not a bad person, but he was a product of his father's suffocating influence. He saw his sister's quiet sadness, but he didn't know how to reach across the chasm their father had dug between them. He had been taught that sentiment was a weakness, that the farm came first, that the family name was a god to be served above all else. His silence on the night of Ilara's banishment was not born of malice but of a lifetime of training. He was a good soldier, following the only commander he had ever known. And then there was Martha, their mother. She was a woman who had faded over the years, like a photograph left too long in the sun. She had once been vibrant. Ilara had seen pictures of her, but decades of living in Silas's shadow had worn her down to a whisper. Her love for her children was real, a fierce, protective thing she kept hidden in the deepest corners of her heart, for fear that Silas would see it as a competing loyalty. She communicated her affection in small, secret gestures: an extra cookie left on Ilara's nightstand, a favorite dress mended with invisible stitches, a gentle touch on the arm when Silas wasn't looking. But she was a captive trapped in the cage of her marriage. She had learned early on that to defy Silas was to invite a cold, withering storm of disapproval that could last for weeks, a silence more punishing than any physical blow. She chose survival for herself and, she believed, for her children, unaware that her silence was its own form of poison. The world beyond the farm's decaying fences was no kinder. They lived near the small town of Oakhaven, a place where traditions were held tight and reputations were everything. Oakhaven was a town of watchful eyes and quiet whispers. The Blackwood family was regarded with a mixture of respect and fear. They were old money, landed gentry in a world that was slowly moving on. People tipped their hats to Silas in the street, but they talked about him behind his back. They whispered about his temper, about the strain on Martha's face, about the fact that the farm wasn't as prosperous as it used to be. There were rumors of debts, of a loan taken against the land, a secret vulnerability that made Silas's obsession with appearances all the more frantic. For Ilara, a trip to town was an exercise in performance. She had to be the perfect daughter, smiling, demure, a walking advertisement for the flawless Blackwood brand, all the while feeling the weight of the community's collective gaze. This suffocating world, this gilded cage, was all she had ever known. And so, when a new farmhand arrived one spring, it was like a window being thrown open in a sealed room. His name was Daniel. He was not from Oakhaven. He was a traveler, working his way across the country, and he had a kindness in his eyes that Ilara had never seen before. He didn't see her as a Blackwood. He saw her as Ilara. He saw the girl who loved to read books in the hayloft, the girl who knew the names of all the wildflowers that grew by the creek, the girl who dreamed of seeing the ocean. He listened to her. It was a simple act, but to Ilara it was a miracle. He spoke of cities where no one knew your name, of a life where you could be whoever you wanted to be. He didn't offer her a future, not really, but he offered her a present, a few stolen moments of being seen, of being valued for who she was, not what she represented. Their romance was a secret, a fragile thing that bloomed in the hidden corners of the farm. They met in the dim, dusty light of the barn, after her father was asleep, or down by the creek where the willows dipped their branches into the water, creating a green curtain that shielded them from the world. It was innocent, a desperate search for warmth in a cold, sterile life. For Ilara, it was not an act of rebellion. It was an act of survival. She was starving for affection, and he was the first person to ever offer it freely, without condition, without expectation. Their connection was a quiet rebellion, not against her father, but against the crushing loneliness that defined her existence. It was a grasp for the very thing her home had never provided: unconditional love. When she discovered she was pregnant, her first feeling was not shame, but a profound and terrifying joy. In a life where she felt she had nothing of her own, this child was hers. It was a living, breathing piece of the only real love she had ever known. It was a secret she held close to her heart, a tiny, flickering candle of hope in the overwhelming darkness. She was naive, of course. She imagined in some desperate corner of her mind that she could run away with Daniel, that they could build a life somewhere new, somewhere far from the judgment of Oakhaven and the cold fury of her father. She didn't understand the forces she was up against. She didn't understand that for a man like Silas, her body was not her own. It was Blackwood property, and her unsanctioned pregnancy was not a personal mistake, but an act of unforgivable treason against his name. The discovery of her secret was inevitable. It was Martha who found her being sick one morning, and the look on her mother's face was not one of compassion, but of pure, unadulterated terror. She knew what this meant. She knew the wrath that was about to be unleashed. The secret traveled from mother to father, not as a delicate family matter to be discussed, but as a report of a breach in security. The weeks that followed were a slow, agonizing tightening of a noose. The air in the house grew thick and heavy, charged with unspoken accusations. Silas watched her with a cold, calculating detachment, as if she were a piece of livestock that had been inexplicably ruined. He was not planning how to help his daughter. He was planning how to excise a tumor from his legacy. The farm itself seemed to conspire in her condemnation. The well, which had provided water for generations, finally began to run dry that summer. It was a practical problem, a financial disaster, but for Silas, it was an omen. He saw it as a sign of the impurity that had seeped into his land, into his house, into his bloodline. The dry well became a symbol of her sin. The cracked, thirsty earth was a mirror of the barrenness she had brought upon his name. He was a man who saw the world in signs and symbols, and every dying crop, every struggling animal, was now a reflection of his daughter's deep and unforgivable failure. He was building his case, not just to himself, but to the god of pride he worshipped. So, when the rains finally came that fateful autumn night, it wasn't a relief, it was a judgment. The sky opened up, and the deluge was biblical, as if the heavens themselves were trying to wash away a stain. For Silas, it was the perfect backdrop for his righteous fury. He was not just a father disciplining a child, he was an instrument of a higher order, a patriarch cleansing his house. He was pruning the diseased branch to save the tree, a metaphor he had used often when talking about the farm. But he was blind. He couldn't see that Ilara wasn't a disease. She was the only thing in that house that had ever tried to grow towards the light, reaching for a love that the barren soil of her family could never provide. And this is the heart of the injustice, the reason her pain would curdle into a rage so potent it could topple an empire. She wasn't cast out for a crime she had committed, but for a need she had dared to have, the need to be loved. Her father's pride was a fragile, hollow thing, built on a foundation of appearances and control. He needed to believe his family was perfect, that his legacy was pure, and her pregnancy shattered that illusion. He didn't banish a daughter. He banished a mirror that showed him his own failure, his own inability to love, his own emotional drought that was far more destructive than any lack of rain. He threw her into the storm to save himself from the truth, but what was about to happen in the long, dark years ahead would prove that you can never outrun the truth, and a debt of pain left unpaid only gathers interest over time. The long walk from Blackwood Farm was a journey through a waking nightmare. The storm, which had been the backdrop to her expulsion, now became her tormentor. Rain, driven by a relentless wind, found its way through the thin fabric of her dress, chilling her to the bone. The mud of the lane, the very earth that was supposed to be her birthright, sucked at her bare feet, trying to pull her down, to swallow her whole. Each step was a battle against the elements and against the crushing weight of what had just happened. The house behind her, with its warm lights and its silent, complicit family, shrank into the darkness until it was just another shadow in a world made of them. She was a ghost leaving her own haunting grounds. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time had lost its meaning, replaced by the rhythm of her shivering and the frantic, terrified beating of her own heart. Finally, the muddy lane gave way to the paved road leading into Oakhaven, a town that was about to become her new, more intimate prison. Her first instinct was to seek refuge, to find a familiar face in the hostile darkness. She remembered Mrs. Gable, a woman from their church, a woman whose smile had always seemed so kind, so full of Christian charity. Ilara stumbled to her porch, her knuckles raw as she knocked on the door, the sound swallowed by the storm. When the door opened a crack, revealing Mrs. Gable's face etched with alarm and confusion, a sliver of hope ignited in Ilara's chest. But the hope died as soon as she explained, in broken whispers, what had happened. Mrs. Gable's face, a mask of sympathy a moment before, hardened into a wall of polite, unassailable judgment. She saw not a terrified, pregnant girl in need of shelter, but a scandal standing on her doorstep. She spoke of reputation, of what people would say, of the difficulty of the situation. Her words were soft, but her meaning was as sharp and cold as a shard of glass. She pressed a folded dollar bill into Ilara's hand, a transaction to soothe her own conscience, and gently, firmly, closed the door, leaving Ilara standing once again in the rain, the sound of the latch clicking shut a cruel echo of her father's final rejection. The weeks that followed were a blur of cold rooms and gnawing hunger. The dollar from Mrs. Gable was gone in 2 days, spent on a piece of dry bread and a night in a boarding house room that smelled of mildew and despair. She tried to find work, but her swollen belly and the haunted look in her eyes were a brand, a clear sign of her fallen state. Doors were closed to her with the same quiet finality as Mrs. Gable's. The physical toll of the stress, the lack of food, and the constant bone-deep cold began to wear on her body and on the fragile life she carried within her. One night, a sharp, cramping pain seized her, a pain so fierce it stole her breath. She was alone in that cheap, cold room with no one to call for, no hand to hold. The ordeal lasted for hours, a private, silent agony in the heart of a sleeping town. By the time the grey light of dawn filtered through the grimy window, the pain had subsided, but it had taken something with it. It had taken the one thing she had left in the world that was truly hers. She had lost the baby, a silent, lonely tragedy that would carve a permanent, aching hollow in her soul. This loss was a different kind of pain than her father's rejection. That had been a sharp, violent severing. This was a slow, hollowing grief, a wound that would never fully close. She felt a profound and suffocating guilt, a belief that she had failed this tiny, innocent life, that her weakness had been its death sentence. In her darkest moments, she heard her father's voice in her head, telling her she was a stain, a bringer of ruin, and now she had the proof. He had banished her, and in doing so, he had passed a death sentence not just on her future, but on his own grandchild. The rain that had been her tormentor on that first night now became her constant companion, a storm that raged not in the sky, but inside her. The rage that had been a tiny, glowing ember was now being fed by a new, more potent fuel. The grief for a child she would never know, a child who was the ultimate victim of Silas Blackwood's pride. Survival became a grim, mechanical process. She finally found work at a greasy roadside diner on the edge of town, a place where no one cared about her past, as long as she could scrub pots until her hands were raw. The owner, a man named Henderson with a sour face and sweat-stained shirts, was a petty tyrant. He paid her less than the other workers, knowing she was in no position to complain. He would pile the dirtiest dishes in front of her, making her stay late into the night, his small, cruel eyes seeming to take pleasure in her exhaustion. He was a different kind of antagonist than her father. Silas was a king defending his legacy. Henderson was a vulture, feasting on the weak and the desperate. He was a daily, grinding reminder of her new place in the world, a world where she had no name, no protection, and no value beyond what could be extracted from her aching body. The humiliation was constant, 1,000 tiny cuts each day. Henderson would make comments just loud enough for her to hear, referring to her as the charity case. One afternoon, a farmer from a neighboring property to Blackwood Farm came into the diner. He recognized her instantly, his eyes widening with a mixture of shock and pity. He didn't speak to her, but he spoke about her to Henderson at the counter, their whispers carrying across the diner, painting her as the disgraced daughter, the town scandal. Henderson listened with a smirk, and for the rest of the week he was even crueler, as if the confirmation of her shame gave him a renewed sense of power over her. She would stand at the sink, hot, greasy water, scalding her hands, and feel the weight of every eye in the room, every whisper a fresh application of salt to her wounds. She was no longer a person, she was a story, a cautionary tale told by men over cheap coffee. This social condemnation extended beyond the diner. In the boarding house where she lived, the other women, mostly weary factory workers and widows, kept their distance. They would fall silent when she entered the shared kitchen, their conversations resuming in hushed tones as soon. As she left, she was a threat to their own fragile respectability, a living embodiment of the fate that could befall any woman who stepped outside the rigid lines drawn by their society. The men were different. Some looked at her with a contempt that mirrored her father's, while others looked at her with a predatory glint in their eyes, seeing her as damaged goods, as someone who could be used without consequence. She learned to make herself small, to walk with her eyes on the ground, to become as invisible as possible. And you who have perhaps felt the sting of a false rumor or an unfair judgment, can you imagine that feeling magnified 1,000 times? To have your entire identity erased and replaced by a single, shameful label, to be seen not for who you are, but for the worst moment of your life. It is a kind of living death, a solitude so profound, it threatens to extinguish the very will to live. After nearly a year of this soul-crushing existence, a small, fragile ray of light appeared. She found a new job working as a seamstress in the back room of a dress shop in a neighboring town, a place where no one knew her name. The owner, a stern older woman named Mrs. Albright, was demanding but fair. She didn't pry into Ilara's past. She only cared about the quality of her stitches. For the first time since she'd left the farm, Ilara felt a flicker of something akin to peace. The work was quiet and meticulous, and in the steady rhythm of the needle and thread, she found a small measure of solace. She saved every penny she could, renting a slightly cleaner, brighter room. She began to imagine a future, not a happy one, but a stable one, a life where she might one day be left alone with her grief, free from the constant judgment of others. It was a small, humble dream, but it was hers. The dream, like all her others, was destined to be shattered. One afternoon, a well-dressed woman came into the shop to order a custom gown. It was Mrs. Gable. Her eyes widened in recognition as she saw Ilara, and a look of deep discomfort crossed her face. She didn't acknowledge Ilara directly, but the next day, Mrs. Albright called Ilara into her office. The woman who had been so professional and distant now looked at her with a pained expression. She explained that Mrs. Gable was an old family friend and an important client. She had told Mrs. Albright the whole story about the disgraced Blackwood girl. Mrs. Albright said she couldn't afford to have that kind of trouble associated with her business. She wasn't angry, she explained, almost apologetically, but business was business. She paid Ilara her final week's wages and let her go. This betrayal was somehow worse than Henderson's cruelty. It wasn't born of malice, but of cowardice, of the quiet, respectable complicity that upheld the very system that was trying to destroy her. It taught her the most devastating lesson of all. There was no escape. Her father's judgment wasn't just his own. It was the law of the land, and it would follow her wherever she went. This was the blow that finally broke her. She was out of work again, her meager savings dwindling with each passing day. Winter was setting in, a bitter, biting cold that seemed to mock the emptiness inside her. She fell ill, a deep, rattling cough that left her weak and breathless. She couldn't afford a doctor, couldn't even afford a decent meal. She spent her days walking the frozen streets, looking for any kind of work, and nights shivering in her unheated room, listening to the wind howl outside her window. The world had become a vast, indifferent expanse of grey slush and shuttered windows. The burning rage that had sustained her for so long began to cool, replaced by a profound, chilling despair. She had fought, she had endured, she had survived, but for what? To be endlessly punished for a single mistake, for a moment of desperate, youthful love. The injustice of it was so immense, so absolute, that it no longer sparked anger. It just crushed her. One evening, her money finally gone, she was turned out of her room. She found herself wandering the back alleys of the town, the snow beginning to fall in thick, wet flakes, melting on her feverish skin. She huddled in a darkened doorway, the cough racking her body, her strength completely gone. She looked at her hands, thin and pale in the dim light, and saw nothing but failure. Her father had cast her out, expecting the world to devour her, and he had been right. The world was winning. The fight was gone. She felt a strange sense of peace in the surrender, the letting go of all hope, all anger, all pain. She closed her eyes, the cold seeping into her bones, a welcome numbness spreading through her limbs. This was it. This was the end of her story. A pathetic, forgotten footnote in the grand legacy of the Blackwoods. The fire inside her, the one forged in the storm on her father's porch, had dwindled to a single, fading ember, about to be extinguished by the cold, indifferent snow. She had been pushed to the absolute brink, and she had finally fallen over the edge. There was no one coming for her. There was no hope of rescue. As the darkness began to close in around her, she thought of her father, warm in his house, his legacy secure, and for the first time she felt nothing. Not hatred, not rage, not sorrow. Just a vast, empty silence. It was the silence of absolute defeat. The moment, just before the end. And it was in this very moment, in this abyss of utter hopelessness, that the world which had taken everything from her was about to make a single catastrophic miscalculation. It thought it was burying her, but it was only planting a seed in the frozen ground, a seed that against all odds was about to find a reason to grow. It was not a hand of mercy that found her in the darkness, but one of cold, detached assessment. A man stood over her, his form a sharp, dark silhouette against the faint glow of a distant street lamp. He was not dressed like anyone from Oakhaven. His coat was tailored, dark wool, and his shoes were polished leather, impossibly clean amidst the city's grime. He held an umbrella, not for himself, but angled slightly to shield her from the worst of the falling snow, a gesture so oddly practical it was unnerving. He said nothing for a long moment, his eyes, barely visible in the shadows, seeming to catalogue her, the feverish flush on her cheeks, the thinness of her wrists, the hollow despair in her half-open eyes. She expected him to move on, another passerby averting his gaze from the ugliness of the world, but he didn't. When he finally spoke, his voice was not filled with pity, but with a strange, unnerving clarity, a voice like the quiet click of a well-oiled machine. "You have the look," he said, the words cutting through the fog of her fading consciousness. "The look of a woman who has been burned to the ground and is wondering if she should rise from the ashes or simply let the wind scatter them." Ilara could only stare, the effort to form a word too great. He knelt beside her, his movements precise, economical. He was in his late 30s, his face sharp and intelligent, marked by a weariness that wasn't of the body, but of the mind. There were no soft edges to him. "My name is Kyle," he said, as if making a business introduction in the filth of a back alley. "I have an interest in men like your father, men who build empires on the backs of others, who mistake pride for strength and cruelty for principle. I dismantle them, it's what I do." He paused, his gaze intense, searching. "But I find my work is most effective when it is delivered by a ghost from their past. Your father, Silas Blackwood, he thinks you are dead, doesn't he? Or worse, forgotten. He believes the world has swallowed you whole." He offered her nothing but the cold, hard truth of her situation, and in it a question. "He is wrong. The world hasn't swallowed you. It has been sharpening you." A flicker of defiance, so faint she barely recognized it, stirred in the cold embers of her soul. Who was this man? How did he know her name? Her father's name? Fear mingled with a desperate, shocking curiosity. He saw the question in her eyes. "I make it my business to know things," he said simply. "I know about the farm. I know about the whispers of debt. I know about the night you were thrown into the storm. And I know that the kind of pain you carry is not a weakness. It is a fuel. It is a currency. And right now it is the only thing you have left of any value." He reached into his coat and pulled out not a blanket or a piece of bread, but a simple, clean business card. "I am offering you a choice. You can stay here and let the cold finish the job your father started, or you can come with me. I will not offer you comfort. I will not offer you pity. I will offer you a purpose. I will offer you a weapon, the most powerful weapon of all, the chance to write the final chapter of his story." For a long, silent moment, the world hung in the balance. Every instinct screamed at her to recoil from this stranger, this man who spoke of pain as a tool and vengeance as a business. But what was the alternative? The slow, anonymous death she had already accepted? She looked at his outstretched hand, holding the small white card, and saw not a lifeline, but a blade, a chance not to be saved, but to be forged. The memory of the heavy oak door slamming shut, the sound of the latch clicking into place echoed in her mind, the memory of Mrs. Gable's polite rejection, the memory of Mrs. Albright's cowardly dismissal, the memory of losing her child, alone in that cold, silent room. The injustices piled up, one on top of the other, and the cold, dead ember of her rage, the one she thought had been extinguished forever, glowed with a sudden, fierce heat. With a strength she did not know she possessed, she reached out her trembling hand and took the card. It was a choice, an act of pure, desperate courage. She was choosing to live, not for survival, but for the reckoning he had promised. The years that followed were a crucible. Kyle was true to his word. He offered no comfort. He took her from the brink of death and plunged her into an education more rigorous and demanding than any she could have imagined. Her new life began not in a warm home, but in a sparse, clean apartment, in a city so large and anonymous it felt like another planet. The first lesson was not in strategy, but in healing. He brought doctors who mended her broken body, and he brought books that began to mend her broken mind. He taught her that her past was not a source of shame, but a case study. "Analyze it," he would say, his voice cool and methodical as they sat across from each other late at night, surrounded by stacks of books on finance, law, and psychology. "Dissect every decision, every weakness. Your father's pride is not a monolith. It is a structure, and every structure has load-bearing walls. Find them." She shed the identity of Ilara Blackwood, the disgraced daughter, like a snake sheds its skin. Cale gave her a new name, a new history, a new way of carrying herself. She learned to speak without the soft, rural accent of her youth, her voice becoming measured and clear. She learned to dress in the sharp, understated lines of the corporate world, her clothes a form of armor. She learned about leverage, about assets, about how power truly works in a world that pretends to run on morality, but is fueled by debt and desire. He would put financial statements in front of her, the accounts of powerful men he was targeting, and teach her to read them like a story, to find the hidden narratives of greed and fear in the cold, hard numbers. She discovered she had a mind for it, a natural talent for seeing patterns, for understanding the intricate web of obligations and vulnerabilities that held men like her father in place. The quiet, observant girl who was taught to be invisible had learned to see everything. Her transformation was profound. The haunted, fearful look in her eyes was replaced by a calm, unnerving intelligence. The fire of her rage, which had once been a wild, consuming inferno of grief and pain, was now banked and controlled. Kyle had taught her to channel it, to turn that raw, emotional heat into a focused, cold-burning flame, a laser capable of cutting through steel. She was no longer a victim of her past. She was becoming its master, the architect of a meticulous ruin. She became a ghost in a new machine, working alongside Cale, learning his trade. She saw him dismantle other men, men just like Silas, using their own pride, their own secrets, their own greed as the weapons of their destruction. And with each victory she grew more confident, more patient, honing her skills for the one target that truly mattered. Still, the mystery of Cale himself remained. She never knew the source of his wealth, or the full extent of his network. His motives were a locked room to which she had no key. One night after they had successfully orchestrated the downfall of a corrupt shipping magnate, she finally asked him, "Why?" she said, her voice steady. "Why me? Why my father?" He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Because I, too, know what it is to have a legacy stolen," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "And because I recognized the fire in you. Some people are broken by the storm. Others learn to ride the wind." It was not a full answer, but it was enough. It told her that his quest was, in some way, as personal as her own. They were two different kinds of ghosts, haunting two different pasts, but their paths had converged for a single unified purpose. The day finally came when Kyle laid a new file on the table between them. On the cover was a single, stark name, Blackwood. For years, she had avoided looking back, focusing only on moving forward, on becoming someone else. Now she was being asked to turn and face the monster of her past, not as a frightened girl, but as an equal, a predator. Together they began to dig. They pulled property records, loan agreements, bank statements. They traced the slow, steady decay of the farm, the mounting debts Silas had hidden behind his iron wall of pride. They built a detailed map of his life, his vulnerabilities, his secrets. And it was in the dusty archives of the Oakhaven County Courthouse, buried in a faded birth ledger from over 2 decades ago, that she found it. An entry that made her blood run cold. A name, a date, a detail so small and yet so catastrophic it had the power to bring the entire Blackwood legacy crashing down. It was a lie, a foundational lie, that had been hiding in plain sight for her entire life. The storm that had cast her out was a force of nature, random and chaotic, but the storm that was coming for Silas Blackwood was not. It was a storm she had built, herself piece by piece, cloud by cloud. It was precise, it was calculated, and it was aimed directly at the heart of his pride. And you, who have followed her journey from that rain-slicked porch to this moment of quiet, terrible power, ask yourself this. If you were given the chance to face the person who broke you, armed not with pleas for mercy, but with the cold, hard truth of their own hypocrisy, would you have the courage to do it? Would you be willing to become the storm? For Ilara, there was no longer a choice. The Harvest Festival, her father's annual pageant of prosperity and family honor, was just weeks away. It would be the perfect stage. He had banished her in the darkness of a storm, in front of a jury of 3. She would deliver her verdict in the bright, festive light in front of the entire world. What was about to happen was more than revenge. It was a correction, a balancing of the scales, and what was to come would be the most decisive night of her life. He had cast her into the wind, expecting her to scatter like ash. He never imagined she would return commanding the lightning. The annual Blackwood Harvest Festival was the crown jewel of Silas's year, his personal theatre of prosperity. It was a carefully staged performance for the entire county, designed to quell the quiet rumors of his financial strain and project an image of unshakable generational strength. Lanterns were strung between the ancient oaks, casting a warm, golden glow on tables groaning with food. The sound of a hired fiddle band soared through the crisp autumn air, and the scent of roasted corn and spiced cider hung heavy, a perfume of abundance. The people of Oakhaven mingled on the manicured lawn, their faces turned up toward the grand house, their smiles a mixture of genuine enjoyment and practiced deference. Silas moved among them, a king in his court, accepting their praise with a magnanimous nod, his hand resting possessively on Thomas's shoulder. This was his legacy, tangible and triumphant, a perfect portrait of a life well lived. But every perfect picture is a lie waiting to be exposed. The first sign that the performance was about to end was the crunch of tires on the gravel of the long lane, a sound that did not belong to a farm truck or a neighbor's sedan. A sleek black car, impossibly urban and out of place in this rustic tableau, rolled to a silent stop at the edge of the lawn. Its presence was an immediate and jarring note of discord, and one by one, the conversations faltered. The fiddle player's bows scraped to a halt and every head turned. A man emerged from the driver's side, a figure of sharp angles and expensive wool, his face calm and unreadable. It was Kyle. He held the passenger door open, and from the car stepped a ghost. It was Ilara, but it was not the Ilara they remembered. The broken, weeping girl who had been swallowed by a storm years ago was gone. In her place stood a woman of impossible poise. She wore a simple, dark dress that spoke of a quiet, unassailable confidence. Her hair, once the color of wheat, was now a shade darker, pulled back from a face that had been sharpened by hardship into something beautiful and severe. Her eyes, once wide pools of fear, were now calm, direct, and held a chilling, absolute clarity. She did not look like a victim seeking pity. She looked like a judge arriving to deliver a sentence. The silence that fell over the festival was no longer one of curiosity. It was a thick, heavy blanket of dread. Silas saw her, and for a single fleeting moment, the mask of the proud patriarch slipped. A flicker of something unreadable, shock, fear, perhaps even a shadow of guilt, crossed his face before it was instantly replaced by a thunderous rising fury. He took a step forward, his body rigid, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Beside him, Thomas froze, his face a canvas of pure, uncomprehending confusion. He saw the woman, but he could not connect her to the vague, half-forgotten memory of the sister he had been taught to forget. And from the porch, where she was overseeing the serving tables, Martha saw her daughter. A strangled gasp escaped her lips, a sound of pure terror, and a tray of glasses slipped from her trembling hands, shattering on the stone steps with a sound that cracked the silence like a gunshot. "You have no place here," Silas boomed, his voice carrying across the lawn, the voice of a king casting a leper from his gates. He began to stride toward her, his intention clear, to physically remove this stain from his perfect evening. The crowd, his loyal subjects, parted before him, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid fascination. They were about to witness a family drama, a piece of local gossip made flesh. But as Silas drew closer, his face contorted with rage, Ilara did not flinch. She did not retreat. She simply stood her ground, her gaze locked on his, and the sheer, unyielding force of her stillness stopped him in his tracks a few feet away. "I am not here for a place, Father," she said, and the sound of her voice stunned the crowd into a deeper silence. It was not the voice of a begging child. It was low, steady, and carried an authority that rivaled his own. "I am here to correct the record. You are all gathered here tonight to celebrate the Blackwood legacy, are you not?" She turned her gaze from her father, letting it sweep over the assembled guests, her eyes lingering for a moment on the face of Mrs. Gable, who looked as though she had seen an apparition. "You are here to honor a name built on hard work, on tradition, on honor, a name you believe to be pure. And you, who have been a witness to her journey, can you feel the shift in the air? Can you feel the power dynamic, once so absolute, begin to tremble and crack? This is the moment every wronged soul dreams of, not a moment of violence, but of clarity, a moment where the truth, held down for so long, finally begins to rise to the surface, and the one who tried to bury it is forced to watch it emerge, helpless to stop it. This was no longer Silas's stage. It was Ilara's. "A legacy is a story we tell ourselves," Ilara continued, her voice resonating in the unnatural quiet. "And you, Father, are a master storyteller. You told a story about me. You told this town, you told your family, you told yourself that I was a stain on your honor, that my sin was so great it had to be cut out, cast into the storm to protect the purity of the Blackwood bloodline." She took a slow, deliberate step toward him, and he, for the first time in his life, took an involuntary step back. "But the story you told was a lie. Not because I was innocent, but because your honor was already a hollow, rotten thing long before I ever made a mistake." Her words hung in the air, sharp and poisonous. Silas's face was now a mask of purple rage. "Get her out of here," he snarled at Thomas, who stood frozen, caught between the father he had always so obeyed and the sister who was now a stranger speaking a terrifying new language. Thomas looked from Silas's furious face to Ilara's unnervingly calm one, and for the first time he did not move. A seed of doubt, of confusion, had taken root. Ilara ignored him, her focus entirely on Silas. "You built your entire world on the idea of a pure bloodline, of a worthy heir to carry your name. You worshipped it. You sacrificed your own daughter to it. You held up my brother, Thomas, as the symbol of that purity, the future of this farm, the continuation of your precious name." She now turned her gaze to Thomas, and it softened, but only for a moment, tinged with something that looked almost like pity. "Thomas," she said, her voice clear and precise, "you have spent your entire life carrying the weight of a legacy that was never yours to begin with." This was the moment the ground began to give way. Thomas stared at her, his mouth slightly agape, a deep line of confusion etched between his brows. "What are you talking about?" he managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. Ilara did not answer him directly. Instead, she looked past both men, her eyes finding her mother, who was cowering by the porch steps, her face as white as a sheet. Martha's eyes were wide with a terror that was no longer just about the confrontation. It was the terror of a long-buried secret about to be exhumed. "Ask her," Ilara said, her voice dropping, becoming almost gentle, which was somehow more menacing. "Ask your mother, Thomas. Ask her about the summers when Father would travel to the city for cattle auctions. Ask her about the long, lonely afternoons. Ask her about your real father." She let the last two words hang in the air, each one a perfectly weighted stone dropped into a still pond, the ripples spreading outwards, touching every single person on that lawn. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum where all sound, all air, all thought had ceased to exist. Thomas turned his head slowly, mechanically, to look at his mother. The question was in his eyes, a desperate, pleading, terrified question. Martha met his gaze, and her entire body seemed to collapse in on itself. A single ragged sob tore from her throat, a sound of utter and complete surrender. It was all the confirmation anyone needed. Silas lunged then, not at Ilara, but at Martha, his rage finally finding its true target. "You lie!" he roared, his voice cracking, the sound of a man whose entire world had just been vaporized. But Cale, who had been standing silently by the car this entire time, moved with a speed that was startling. He was suddenly between Silas and Martha, not touching him, but his presence was an impassable wall. "I wouldn't," Cale said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute finality. "It's no lie," Ilara said, her voice cutting through the chaos. She held up a thin file she had been carrying. "It's just a story that was never told." She opened it, pulling out a single, photocopied page. "This is a copy of the Oakhaven County birth ledger. It lists Thomas's birth, and under the father's name, it is indeed signed Silas Blackwood. But there is another document, a private one, a letter written by our mother to a man named Jacob Miller, a neighboring landowner who died 20 years ago. A letter in which she confesses that the child she carries is his, begging him for help. Help he obviously never gave. The name Jacob Miller landed like a second explosion. He had been Silas's greatest rival, a man Silas had despised with a quiet burning passion for his entire adult life. The humiliation was now absolute, a multi-layered masterpiece of destruction. Not only was his heir not his, but he was the son of the one man on earth he could not abide. The crowd erupted in a furious wave of whispers, their loyalty to Silas evaporating in the face of a scandal so monumental, so perfectly ironic. It was the stuff of legend. Thomas looked as if he had been struck by lightning. His identity, his past, his future, everything he had ever known to be true had been erased in the space of 30 seconds. He stumbled backward, his eyes darting between the weeping woman on the porch, who was his mother, and the broken, raging man who was not his father. He was no longer the heir to Blackwood Farm. He was the living symbol of its greatest shame. He was nothing. Silas Blackwood, the Titan, the patriarch, the man of iron, finally broke. The rage drained out of him, replaced by a hollow grey emptiness. His broad shoulders slumped. His face, which had been a roadmap of pride, now just looked old and tired. He looked at Ilara, and for the first time, she saw him not as a monster, but as what he truly was. A small, frightened man who had built a fortress of pride around his own insecurities, a fortress she had just leveled with a single, well-aimed truth. He had cast her out for a sin that paled in comparison to the lie he had been living every single day. Ilara felt a strange, hollow ache in her chest. She had expected to feel triumph, a hot, satisfying rush of victory. But looking at the wreckage of her family, the shattered pieces of the people who had created her and then discarded her, she felt only a profound and weary sadness. This was not a victory. It was a demolition. It was the necessary, brutal work of tearing down a condemned building before something new could ever hope to grow in its place. She walked past her father, who did not seem to see her, his eyes fixed on some distant point of his own ruined history. She walked past Thomas, who was staring at his hands as if he had never seen them before. She stopped in front of her mother. Martha looked up at her, her face streaked with tears and shame. "I'm sorry," Martha whispered, the words she should have said a lifetime ago. Ilara looked down at her, her expression unreadable. "You were a prisoner," Ilara said, her voice devoid of accusation. "Now you are free." It was not forgiveness. It was a statement of fact, a release. She then turned, her work complete, and walked back toward the car where Kyle was waiting. The crowd parted for her again, but this time their faces held a new expression, awe and a little bit of fear. She had come back from the dead, not as a supplicant, but as an avenging angel, and had laid waste to the most powerful man in their small world. As she passed Mrs. Gable, their eyes met. There was no triumph in Ilara's gaze, only a quiet finality that was more damning than any curse. Mrs. Gable looked away, her face burning with a shame that was decades overdue. As the door of the black car closed, sealing her away from the ruins of Blackwood Farm, Ilara looked out the window one last time. She saw the lanterns still glowing, a mockery of celebration. She saw the people beginning to drift away, their appetites for food replaced by an insatiable appetite for gossip. And she saw the three figures at the heart of the devastation, her family, now just three strangers standing in the wreckage of their shared life. She had done it. She had repaid the debt. She had burned his empire to the ground, an empire built on the hollow foundations of a lie. The resolution was not found in a tearful embrace or a moment of shared understanding. It was found in the quiet, somber drive away from that place, in the knowledge that the truth, no matter how painful, had finally been spoken. Her redemption was not in being welcomed back, but in the freedom of never having to look back again. She had not destroyed a family. She had simply exposed the fact that it had never truly existed in the first place. She had reclaimed her story, not by rewriting the beginning, but by seizing control of the end. And isn't that a truth we all understand on some level? How many times in our own lives are we put into a cage, not of steel bars, but of judgment? A cage built by the expectations of family, the whispers of a community, or the harsh verdict of our own inner critic. We are told who we are, what we are worth, and what our place is. But the story of Elara is a testament to a powerful, universal truth. No cage can hold a spirit that has decided it is time to be free. There always comes a day, a moment, when the locks can be broken, when the story can be rewritten, when the person you were told you had to be dies to make way for the person you were always meant to become. It is a turning point, a moment of reckoning where you take the pain that was meant to destroy you and forge it into the key that sets you free. It is the moment you stop being the victim of your story and become its author. The scales of justice may grind slowly, and the world may feel cold and unforgiving, but the human heart, when fueled by a righteous truth, holds a fire that can melt any chain and light the way out of any darkness. If this story spoke to a truth in your own life, if you have ever felt the profound release of a personal reckoning or the quiet power of a turning point, share that strength with us. Write in the comments below, "I have had a turning point too," because every story of survival shared is another lantern lit in the dark, showing someone else the way home.